Welcome back to the composition submission entry contest thing. Today I am taking a look at the next 10 submissions that I got for the composition submission. This has been so much fun and I've gotten a lot of positive response from you all from part 1, which I really appreciate. So I will likely be doing this again sometime in the distant or not so distant future. So if you didn't get to submit for this batch, then please consider submitting to the next batch, because I think it'll be a lot of fun and I'd love to hear some new works. So let's just get right into it. I'm going to play the next piece, and it is by... I broke it. And it is by Eric Krakenez. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his last name right. And the piece is called Midnight. Cool, awesome. Thanks for your submission, Eric. So I noticed a couple things. First off, I really love the tone color, like the choice of instrument that you chose. It's like dark and warbly, and I don't know if it was a preset or if it was something that you kind of made and affected, but either way, I really love it. I thought it was a really nice color choice. I like how when you have your bass enter, the second time around with the bass melody, you actually slightly changed it, which I thought was a really good touch. Keep it from getting too repetitive. Some constructive comments that I have. I hear a melody that's happening in the second half that I think could definitely be bumped up in volume to punch out from the harmony of the keyboard. Maybe even trying a different tone might help that melody stand out, as opposed to having something that's kind of similar sounding to the keyboard. And this kind of brings me into a more detailed point on volume automation. When you have a track, particularly in the pop rock world, not so much the classical world, obviously we think of ideas that we want in the forefront to be louder, but what we don't always think of is the instruments that are already there in the background to get quieter. And so oftentimes a way to kind of balance this is to literally automate the volume so that the harmony gets quieter, which allows for more headroom for the lead, whatever you have in the lead. The reason why we do this is twofold. Number one, it allows for the lead instrument to get even more prominent. Number two, it gives us that extra headroom so that if we were stacking on just one thing on top of another, getting louder and louder, eventually our track would clip. And clipping is bad, it's distortion, we don't like that. So it kind of basically evens it out. We have our foreground material, drops back to allow for this new foreground material to enter. So hopefully that helps. Really great submission though. Keep it coming. Next up, we have Felipe Alvarez, Cambios en el Viento. That was beautiful. Beautiful. I love the way that you took your melody, kind of took some of the patterns that made it what it was, like those rhythmic patterns, and kind of echoed those later. It has a really nice flow to it. I'm going to listen to it actually one more time because it was short. That's a nice triplet figure there. Okay, so with harp, that is achievable, that repeated note thing. It might be a little bit awkward. I would talk to a harp player just to make sure that that's doable and natural, because what's going to happen is going to require them to do some kind of work where they are going to pluck a string like this sort of thing. With harp, unlike piano, the two hands are on opposite sides. So what that means is that to get repeated notes, typically, you'd have one hand do the first note and then have it repeated with the second hand, like this sort of thing. Bum, 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 bum. If your left hand is already doing an arpeggio in the bottom, just make sure that they can actually reach that. So this is where I think it would be a good point to actually send this to a real harp player, have them do a sight reading thing for you, just play it through, and just see what their initial thoughts are. Same goes for a spot later. You actually had a chord that was played bloom all together. Totally fine. Oftentimes it's very idiomatic for the harp to actually roll those chords instead of play them all together. So personal choice, but that's depending on what you want to do. I would also just say that right now your piece is kind of in this comfortable range with the melody being in just one note and then your harmonies kind of being in these closed voicings. I would suggest maybe you try to vary it a little bit by having some open voice chords. So that just means spacing out those chords, so instead of being right next to each other, the notes are actually spaced out a little bit farther apart. And maybe introducing some octaves in your right-hand melody just to give it a little bit more power in certain sections. That might give you some extra variety in the piece to support the melodicism that's already there. So it's a beautiful piece. Definitely keep it up. Next we have Fragmik Symphony No. 2. Nice. Really cool. I like the feature of that odd time signature. Is that a 7, I think? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. Yeah, it's a 7. I like the featuring of the 7/8 with the orchestra. I think it's a really cool feature. I really like that kind of harp section you had where the harp was kind of bubbling, just kind of doing arpeggios up and down. And it was a nice surprise at the end, just dropping the drums in there. I would say a couple things, just from my experience of having live players play. The strings may not have the kind of rhythmic feel that you're looking for with this piece playing arco, meaning playing traditionally on the string. Certain instruments can have a very strong attack and a very percussive attack. Things like brass, woodwinds, most woodwinds, those have a very strong attack. Obviously the percussion instruments as well. Strings, there's always a little bit of an entrance that happens, and because of that, it's not impossible, but it is a little bit more challenging for strings to achieve something like the 7/8, especially if they're doing it with a lot of action in it. If you're asking them all to play in unison to that sort of bum bum ba-dum, bum bum ba-dum, a little bit more achievable. If there's a lot of syncopation that's happening in the piece, it can be tricky for all of these strings to kind of line up rhythmically the way you want them to. So again, this is where I'd say bring it to some string players, see what their opinions are, see if they think it's achievable in an orchestral setting, or if they would have other recommendations. The ways to overcome that, like I said, have them all play a certain rhythm in unison as opposed to dividing them up. That'll help them become more unified as a group and play those rhythms that you'd be looking for. You could also have them play pizzicato. That's a surefire way to kind of turn them into a percussion section and get them to achieve that. I would also say have a look at some orchestral music if you haven't already. Take a look at Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Rite of Spring has a lot of percussive orchestral music in it with lots of odd time signatures that I think you'd really enjoy. And you'll get a really good idea of what can be achieved and how Stravinsky achieved it. But really nice job. It's very innovative, had some really nice colors in it. Next up we have Francis's piece Beyond. Now Francis sent me a PDF only, so what I'm going to do is play through a little bit on the piano and then kind of give my feedback after that. Awesome. So having played through it, it's really nice. The colors that you chose are really beautiful, and I like that you're using groupings of 3 instead of 4 before you break up each chord. It keeps it just a little bit more interesting because that 4 is very expected, especially in pop music, contemporary music. So by doing that 3, you're kind of establishing a pattern and then breaking it before we come to expect it that 4th time, which is nice. On a technical note, every time you've got your arpeggiated pattern in the right hand, you actually have that note in the thumb overlapping with your octaves in the left hand. That's okay, but what we'll typically do for that is we'll add either a parenthetical note, which basically means that note has parentheses on it, which is to say you're not technically having to play this note, but it is part of the melody. Or we could just omit it altogether, so we would have the left hand play the octave and then have it pick up on the second 16th. Another option obviously would be to displace it by an octave, so maybe bring that arpeggiated pattern up an octave, or bring the octave left hand down another octave. All different options that you can do. I would say maybe a point of interest would be, instead of having your little echoing note on the top be the same note as the one from the octaves, maybe you could harmonize it up a third, or maybe even a sixth. A good person's music to check out for this kind of minimal style would be Arvo Pärt. He's written a bunch of music like Spiegel im Spiegel. Kind of uses a similar pattern, moving up in certain steps or increments and having certain rules almost set to the music. I would definitely recommend you check out that music so you get a reference for how one can keep a minimal style and still keep it interesting. But beautiful piece, enjoyed playing it. Next up we have Harry Chapman's Rolling Thunder. Okay, let's roll with that. Really, really nice work. Those strings sounded very realistic, particularly later. I don't know if maybe you tracked in some solo strings on your own, or if you just have some good solo strings VSTs, but they sounded great. Also, the drums sounded really, really clean. Everything was very nice and crisp, which I really liked. And I could hear I think I could hear your influence in the Gears of War soundtrack by Steve Jablonsky. I'm a little bit familiar with that soundtrack, and I could hear some of the overlap. A couple pieces of feedback. I think your overall mix could use a little bit of reverb. Overall, I really like how it does have that dry sound. That's really nice. But I think just to unify all the elements, I think a little bit of reverb could go a long way for you, and just giving it that large space sort of feel that I think you're looking for. Also, really, really liked whatever. You had some kind of an odd color that was happening over your that was a half step too high, and I really liked that. There was something about it that gave it this like off-kiltery feel. About halfway through my listening, I think I was ready for something new, and whether that's just, I think it's just a matter of something subtle. So like, you have these chords that are going blah 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 blah. That's C minor major 7. That chord there, I would recommend maybe trying, instead of just having every single time that all the notes of that chord play, maybe alternate with some different versions where it drops out a little bit, some of the notes drop out, some of them come back in, some of them add up. That'll give you a lot of variety to introduce, and it'll kind of keep the harmony going that you like while introducing that kind of variety. Overall, really nice though. Really, really fits the color. Keep up the good work. Next up, we have Idan Shimesh's The Colors You Can't See. Really nice work. It's a really beautiful piece. I was getting some John Powell vibes, the Dragon series. I don't know if you listen to him or not, but I heard some of that kind of color in there, that playful, light, magical color. So, overall, really great orchestration. Love the colors that you've used in there, the harps, the woodwinds. It's really, really nice and kind of conveys that magical sense that I think you're going for. A couple constructive notes. You have this syncopation that's happening between the harp and it sounds like a low D in the flute. For a regular flute, that low D is going to be pretty low in its range, and because of that, it can be a little difficult for the flute to strike that note with rhythmic accuracy. There's always kind of like a wah that would happen, and so what I would recommend is either put that note in an instrument like maybe a clarinet or a bassoon, something that would be a little higher in the range, that would allow you to then have that note with more accuracy in a true orchestral setting. Also, be mindful of the breathing of the woodwind instruments. So when these instruments are playing, obviously they need space to breathe, and if you can factor that into your writing, it'll make your writing sound more realistic. So if you have eventually they're going to have to breathe. So what a lot of composers will do is they will transfer that over to either a different instrument or either the same group of instrument but a different player. So maybe flute 1 plays the first measure or two, and then it gets picked up by flute 2. Your melody is excellent. I would find ways to really highlight that melody, especially above some of the more counterpoint stuff you have. You have some spots that are pretty busy in counterpoint, and in some ways that might take away from the melody's power, particularly later when you've got the bassoon doing the melody. I think it would be good to kind of keep the rest of the counterpoint a little bit farther back, a little bit quieter, maybe staccato, something to offset the legato arcing quality of the melody. But really beautiful, I loved it. Next we have Jojo Le Pianiste, the All-Star Remix. Jojo! That was awesome. I really, really love that. I picked up some RJD2 vibes, maybe? I don't know if you listened to Ghostwriter by RJD2, but that track and that whole album in general has that kind of like trip-hop, low-key sort of feel that I think you were going for. Couple things. I'd love to teach you a couple chords on the piano that I think could really kind of add some extra jazz elements that it sounds like you're going for with this piece. So I really dig the reharm that you did of kind of bringing the thing down chromatically. This. You could even take that another level and keep bringing it down. Now what I'm doing to kind of achieve that is I'm looking at what the top note is in the melody and basically using that as the extra extensions on the chord. So when I get to the D flat, that tells me, okay, it's probably some kind of major 7. Now I get to the C, so maybe I'll do an augmented 7th chord because that'll include the G sharp in there. That will literally work for any chord. So that's the beauty, is that any note will work to be harmonized with any other chord if you add the proper extension. Now, another really common chord progression in jazz music was when we get to this part. Right now you're doing an A flat major 7. Totally fine. Another option that you could do is this kind of 2-5-1 progression that gets you back to D flat major 7. So it'd be like this. What that is E flat minor 7 going to A flat dominant 7, or A flat. You can add extra extensions if you want. Now if you want to take that another level, at this point we're on F minor 7. What we could do to get to our E flat minor 7 is just move down chromatically. Now we're at E flat minor 7. And now we can resolve it. Fun jazz stuff. I think a little quantization also could go a long way with this piece, because it sounds like you're playing each instrument in one by one. I like the loose feel of it, that everything is kind of like jamming on its own. I think maybe a little bit of quantization could help lock everything in together, particularly at least the drums and the bass. So, nice job. Next up, we have Jonah Williams' Argument. Nice, nice. I think I could hear some of your Undertale influence in there. It reminded me a little bit of Bone Trussel, kind of like a reworking of the format, which is totally fine, you know? I mean, if there's something that you're inspired by, and especially if you're starting out as a composer, I highly recommend taking those influences and kind of reworking them. It teaches you about what makes those pieces work, and it allows you to kind of learn your own style based off of that. So really nice job. I like the harmony. I liked kind of the playfulness of it. A couple notes you have in the bottom, this ba-da-bum. That is super, super difficult to get with one hand, to get in octaves, da-da-dum. So the way that could be achieved is either by taking it with both hands, ba-da-bum, bum, bum, and moving it there, or making it a duet and allowing the secondo to take that da-da-dum and allowing the primo to be able to take the original melody. So it's just something to be aware of. Fast octaves, there's limitations to that. Other than that, I would say there's parts where you've got the melody isolated on its own, and I would recommend maybe adding some extra inner harmony to that. So, ba-da-bum, ba-da-bum, bum, 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 dun, 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 boom, dun, 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 dun. Take it with your left hand, maybe just offbeat based stuff. You're kind of doing it a little bit, but the spots where the melody is on its own, it sounds a little bit empty in some places, and I think it could benefit from a little bit of extra harmony in there. Really nice submission, though. I loved it. Next, we have a piece by Lingchu Marcus, which is untitled. Why didn't you name your piece, Lingchu? Really, really nice job, Lingchu. That was great. What I loved about that was the way that you developed the piece. You started off by repeating this kind of chord progression along with the melody, and then as you expanded, you began to reharmonize it in really, really nice ways. Beautiful reharmonizations. Ending with that major and kind of getting that nice mode in there of the major to the minor 4. That's just a really, really nice color. And you started to introduce some rhythmic acceleration where you started to use those triplet figures. What I would say personally about those triplet figures, I think if you're going to begin to introduce them, maybe there's a way to introduce them a bit more gradually, such as maybe one time you have da 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 dun 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 da 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 dun 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 da 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 da. In other words, having a play back and forth between the triplet pattern and your original rhythmic values might help to transition instead of just jumping right into triplet time, if that makes sense. Beyond that, I think this would be a great opportunity for you to take this piece and then expand it into a couple more instruments. Get a couple more instruments in there, because the piece sounds very finished or full as it is. And I think it'd be cool for you to maybe try like introducing pizzicato cello in there, or maybe getting in like an oboe or clarinet, something to kind of complement it. I think you've got a good grasp on this piece, and I think that could be a way for you to challenge yourself a little bit more. Other than that, mix-wise, I think you've got some spots near the end that get a bit loud. I had to adjust my volume just a little bit to compensate for them. So when you're running these things through a DAW like Logic or GarageBand or Reason or Ableton, you just want to make sure that your dynamic range is not too wide. I know typically we don't do too much compression stuff in classical music and film music, but at the same time you want to make sure there's a nice, reasonable balance, that way you can have it. I would say if you can afford to get a nice piano VST, there's a lot of good ones out there that are not too expensive. I would recommend checking one out. That way you can run your music through those and get a really, really good sound. And then you've got a finished piece that sounds professionally recorded, you know? So, really, really nice submission. Thanks again for submitting it. And our last piece is by Lo Re Alessandro. Really nice, Laura. That took me on a journey. That was really beautiful. I love the way that you moved it chromatically. Kind of reminded me of Chopin's Prelude in E minor, which I thought was really nice. I honestly wouldn't change a thing, particularly with the beginning. I would say as it moves on later, I do like the shift to major, but I think maybe there's a way to keep the interest that you had in the beginning. Could be as simple as introducing some additional voicings. Instead of having those D-flat major chords be in root position, maybe there's a way to kind of delay that resolution a bit by having them be second inversion major chords. Typically, second inversion major chords are used to signify the cadence of a piece, and the reason why is because the lowest note of a second inversion major chord is going to be the 5 of a 1 chord, and 5 always has some pull back to 1. I would also check out some of Michael Andrews' music. He's not a very well-known composer, but he did the music for Donnie Darko. Just be careful when you look through the soundtracks, because some of those tracks are really scary and might make you jump. But some of the tracks have this kind of like Satie-esque impressionistic quality, and kind of have this sense of wandering harmony that I think you might be really attracted to. So I'd definitely check him out if you don't know his music. But that was great. Great submissions from everybody. Really enjoyed looking through those. Can't wait to get to part 3. Again, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments section and I'll get to them. And I will see you in the next part.